the word terrorism, lots of different images will pop up in your mind. And even though most definitions of terrorism mutually agree that terrorism is the use of violence against the civilian population for a political purpose to induce fear, still most definitions are never used in a neutral way. And similarly, when I say the word terrorist organization, chances are you're thinking about a small number of people hiding away in a cave, in a basement, and plotting, maybe acting out irrationally out of hatred and fanaticism, likely both. Well, I've spent the past 10 years studying non-state armed groups. These are organizations that are not under state control and they use violence to challenge it. So think terrorists, insurgents, militias. And I'm convinced that we really need to dig deeper if we want to understand these actors, their evolution, and how they're producing new forms of insecurity that are constantly affecting the civilian population. So to start, these groups are having a global impact. But not all countries are affected the same way. Take a look at this map. If you look in red, you can see 5 countries: Nigeria, Iraq, Syria, Afghanistan, and Pakistan. Now, these 5 countries together in 2014 accounted for 78% of civilian casualties of terrorism. So not all countries are affected the same way. Unfortunately, India is also up there, because in 2014, together again with Nigeria, Iraq, Afghanistan, and Pakistan, it was one of the 5 countries where 60% of terrorist operations were plotted or carried out. So what is this telling us? This is telling us that we need to understand beyond the news headlines the evolution of these groups. To do so, let's start with grasping with a new word, a word in which wars are happening less and less between states, fought between soldiers on a battlefield. And they're happening more and more between states and non-state actors, or between non-state actors themselves. So in the process, armed groups are becoming more important, and not just that, they're learning, they are adapting, they are evolving. I want to show you 3 ways through which this is happening: evolution in economics and fundraising tactics, evolution in communication, and evolution in governance. So first is fundraising. We all know that traditionally insurgents rob banks or kidnap to make money. But today, armed groups are doing way more than that. They invest in legitimate businesses, like construction companies. They make deals with criminal organizations to make money. And they go as far as doing fundraising campaigns. Let me give you an example from ISIS or ISIL or the Islamic State Project, whatever you want to call it. But they are estimated today to be the wealthiest terrorist organization in the world. $2 billion. Now, how do they make this money? They sell oil. They loot, smuggle, and sell Iraq's and Syria archaeological artifacts. But most of the money they make by being a state. They make through taxation. They make through taxing those 8 million people that live under their control. At the same time, they're constantly thinking about fundraising, and they constantly do crowdsourcing campaigns for their supporters. The second is communication. The point here is armed groups have learned to talk to us so that we listen. Again, think of ISIS. We all know they have a very strong social media campaign. They send thousands of tweets every day. And now Twitter is shutting down their accounts. So they're all fleeing to Telegram. And even today, there are hundreds of accounts. One is for the news agency, the ISIS news agency. One sends you pictures on a daily basis of what it's like to live under the Islamic State. And then there's countless of bots accounts that tell you, for example, how to counter anti-ISIS propaganda. But it's more than that. ISIS is not in the media. ISIS is the media. They have a media production company, and they have an army of graphic designers, an army of engineers, and an army of cameramen. These are just as important as the foot soldiers, and together they create a very strong branding campaign. And finally, governance. Governance is key here. We all know that armed groups traditionally invest in work in their communities. Maybe they create healthcare clinics, maybe schools. What they do is they fill a gap left by the government. In doing so, they strengthen their bond with the population beyond violence. A key here is provision of security and safety. Let me take you back to the rise of the Taliban in Afghanistan. And to understand that rise, it's impossible to do so if we don't understand how they stepped into a context of civil war and insecurity, and they offered order and protection to the civilian population. ISIS does the very same. They invest in governance, and by doing so, they challenge what we think states versus non-states are capable of. This is War 3.0. And then there's violence. Violence is not new, and violence is, of course, at the core. But mind you, violence is used strategically, not irrationally, and it's used to send different messages to different audiences. Going back to ISIS. In the territories they control, they use punishments and repression to keep the population at bay, to keep them from rebelling. They also engage in defensive and offensive operations to protect that state project and to expand. And then, then there's terrorism. A group like ISIS uses international terrorism for many purposes. To create fear, to create chaos, to disrupt their enemy society's sense of normalcy, but also to create divisions, us and them, and also to trigger an overreaction, and simultaneously to project power and strength while deterring their enemy. Now, mind you, this is not just ISIS. If you go back a few weeks and you think of the tragic playbook of the Paris attacks, well, it's very familiar to the 26/11 Mumbai plot. What is in common? Terrorist organizations understand that by targeting soft targets and by insisting on mass casualties, they can simultaneously project strength, attract support, and deter their enemy. All this is really important to understand if we want to grasp the sophistication and complexity is really the name of the game for these armed organizations today. This will also help us to understand how they attract support. Again, ISIS. They attract supporters from many different audiences for many different reasons. Now, in Iraq and Syria, many join ISIS because they need a job. And being a fighter is one of the only jobs left in a country that is being ravaged by a bloody war. Others join because they want safety for themselves or for their families. And this is the lesson again. There is a vicious circle between lack of security at the personal and community level and recourse to violence and joining armed groups. It's related. And then, what accounts for foreign fighters from all kinds of countries joining a group like ISIS? There is not one answer, but there's a few things they have in common, like seeking order, seeking stability, seeking a sense of belonging, and seeking to fulfill a sense of rightfulness. Now, it's very easy for us to dismiss it and to say this is incomprehensible, this is irrational, but mind you, by doing so, we will not get any closer to understand these groups and to understand how they thrive and to understand how they catch and attract supporters. So my work is to study our groups through this holistic lens, to study their evolution beyond geography and beyond ideology. I think by doing this, we can really broaden the policy focus. Because when we think of the rise of a group like ISIS, yes, it is a global security challenge. No, it is not just a military one. It's much broader. It's about politics. It's about governance. It's about fairness. It's about representation. Now, it's easy to dismiss, it's easy to ignore, and it's easy to downplay when it comes to a group like ISIS. But this is a mistake we cannot make, at least not if we want to win this fight. Thank you.